Today, we're going to continue our discussion of Chapter 1 and the Introduction to Professional Ethics, and specifically, we're going to be talking about ethical decision making. First, let's talk about the various levels of ethical practice that professionals can engage in. First is mandatory ethics. At this level, the therapist is simply complying with the minimal standards of the profession. So they're following their ethical codes, they're following their laws and regulations, but they're not going above or beyond that. So they're following the basic musts and must nots of the profession. You're simply following the rules. And so therapists who are working at this level are trying to stay safe from legal action and from censure by their professional licensing board. An example of practicing mandatory ethics would be providing informed consent to clients. So the law says we must do this, our ethical codes say that we must do this. So it's mandatory that you follow this rule. Now, mandatory ethics can be compared to aspirational ethics. At this level, the therapist is striving to achieve the highest professional standard of conduct and thought. So you're not just behaving in an ethical way, but you're also thinking about issues in an ethical way. This requires an understanding of the spirit behind the code and the principles upon which the codes rest. So we talked about things like non-maleficence, doing no harm to your clients, justice, fidelity. So these things are reflected in the APA general principles, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. So an example of operating at this aspirational level of ethics will be something like providing pro bono services or providing free services to those in the community who cannot afford your fees. So there's no law that says that you must provide free services. There's no ethical code that says you must provide free services. But we know that we believe in justice and applying our knowledge to all members of the community and not discriminating with how we provide our services. So an example of doing something like that would be providing free services to those who cannot afford them. So this would be operating at that aspirational level, going above and beyond what the law or what your ethical code required you to do. Now, aspirational ethics is part of the positive ethics movement. Positive ethics focus not only on doing no harm to clients, but how we can better serve or better help our clients. So not just focus on the deficits, on the harm that therapists can do to their clients, but also seeking to improve our practice to provide the best possible care for our clients. Another way to think about the levels of ethics would be to compare principle ethics to virtue ethics. Principle ethics are concerned with solving a particular dilemma. So you draw upon your principle ethics when you're faced with an ethical problem that you're not sure how to address. Um, this is concerned with number one, solving those particular ethical dilemmas, but also establishing a framework to guide future ethical decision making and behavior. Principle ethics focus on acts and choices. So, what are you actually doing? And it facilitates the selection of appropriate answers to the question, what shall I do? So it's very pragmatic. It's very focused on solving particular issues. And it's basically asking the question, is this situation unethical? It's seeking to solve a particular problem to address a particular issue by applying the ethical codes. Compared to this, virtue ethics. Virtue ethics focus on the character traits of the therapist and ideals to which they aspire. So this is going back to the idea of those aspirational ethics. You keep virtue ethics in mind even when you're not faced with an ethical dilemma. So you're always thinking this way even when you're not facing a particular ethical problem. And this type of ethics asks, am I doing what is best for my client? So not simply, is this ethical, is this unethical, but am I doing what is in the best interest or what is best for the person that I'm assisting? And with principle ethics and virtue ethics, you're not choosing between the two. In fact, you're integrating these principle ethics as well as virtue ethics. So, of course, there'll be times when you have to address specific ethical problems, but all the time you're keeping in mind, how can I best serve my client? Okay, so when we go back to those aspirational ethics, what are we talking about? we're talking about some basic moral principles that will guide your decision-making process. So these are what we talk about when we're talking about the spirit of the code or the values that underlie our ethical codes. These are things like autonomy, the idea that people have the ability or have the right to make decisions for themselves. Non-maleficence. Of course, we strive to do no harm to our clients or to the public in general. Beneficence. We do good for others, for our clients and for society in general. Justice. We are fair, we give equally to others and treat others justly. So this can speak to trying to make your services available to as large, to as much of the population as possible, and not discriminating with how you provide your services. Fidelity, we are trustworthy. We make realistic commitments and we keep our promises. And veracity, we're truthful in our dealings with our clients and with others. So again, these are the moral principles you keep in mind when trying to make ethical decisions. Now, the previous moral principles that we discussed are pretty much universally accepted within the helping professions. But also the professions are beginning to integrate self-care as a moral principle. So this is the idea that taking adequate care of ourselves so that we can implement the moral principles and virtues that are fundamental to the profession. So because you are the vehicle of caring for your clients, it's important that you care for yourself so that you're in the best possible place to implement these moral principles and virtues. So the APA Ethical Code, the actual name of the document is APA Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct. Again, the title of the actual ethics document is the APA Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct. Now that is broken down into two separate areas, the general principles and the ethical codes. Now the general principles are where we get those moral principles that drive or that underlie our ethics codes. So the general principles of the APA Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct speaks to those aspirational values. So the APA general principles, again, are aspirational. They guide and inspire psychologists toward the highest ethical ideal of the profession, and they do not represent obligations and should not form the basis for imposing sanctions. So again, these are those aspirational things, the things that we should aspire to do, the highest level of professional thought and conduct, but they don't represent obligations. These are things that you do not have to do, and you cannot have sanctions imposed upon you by your licensing board or your professional organization for not following these things because you aspire to be these things. That's in comparison to the ethical codes of the APA Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct. The ethical codes provide specific standards to cover most situations encountered by a psychologist. So these are rules of conduct. You must engage in informed consent. You must explain to your clients the limits of confidentiality. You must try to avoid multiple relationships with clients. So these are rules of conduct and they are enforceable. So if you do not follow these rules, you can be sanctioned by your licensing board or your professional organization. So again, the general principles are where those aspirational, those guiding moral principles are contained within your APA ethics code. So what are the specific aspirational values that are described in the APA ethics codes? So these are very similar. Let me go back a few slides. The APA general principles are very similar to the basic moral principles that are going to guide the ethical decision-making process of any helping professional. So these are just general. These can be applied to any helping profession, but specifically the APA general principles break down those moral principles in this way. So principle A from APA is beneficence and non-maleficence. So we've discussed this, the idea that you take care to do no harm to your clients, and you also try to benefit your clients. You try to enhance their well-being, and you try to improve their functioning. Principle B, fidelity and responsibility. So psychologists establish relationships of trust with those whom we work. As we touched upon, you make commitments that you can fulfill, you are trustworthy, you follow through on things that you say that you're going to do. Principle C, integrity. Psychologists seek to promote accuracy, honesty, and truthfulness in science, teaching, and practice of psychology. So again, you make sure that you are conveying results of research honestly. You are honest with your clients and with the public as far as the services that you are competent to provide and the types of results they can expect through therapy. So just being accurate and honest and truthful in how you deal with your clients and the public. Principle D, justice. Psychologists recognize that fairness and justice entitle all persons to access to and benefit from the contributions of psychology and to equal quality in the processes, procedures, and services being conducted by psychologists. So again, we try to be just in how we distribute our services, how we distribute the results of our research. We're trying to make sure that all segments of society benefit from the work of psychologists and not just those who were able to afford it or to access it easily. We try to make the products of our work accessible to as many people as possible. And principle E, respect for people's rights and dignity. Psychologists respect the dignity and worth of all people and the rights of individuals to privacy, confidentiality, and self-determination. So again, we respect people's rights, we respect their autonomy, we try to preserve people's dignity and allow them to make decisions for themselves as much as possible. And we also respect their rights and privacy and confidentiality. So again, these general principles describe APA's take on the general moral principles that we use to design to guide our ethical decision-making process. And so in the next mini lecture, we'll talk a little bit more about the various steps to making ethical decisions when your ethical codes do not speak directly to what you have to do in a particular situation, and you have to draw upon these general principles to make decisions about how to behave ethically in a particular situation.